Hello everyone and welcome! Today I'm going to be painting up some 15mm Greek miniatures from SX Miniatures for use in Bellis Antiquitatis, an ancient history miniature war game. Of course, these techniques would be useful for any 15mm or other small scale miniatures that you would like to paint up, so hopefully you can follow along with this and get some ideas for projects of your own, whatever they may apply to. In my case, I'm basing these and setting them up for DBA, but of course they could be used for many other war games of the ancient period as well. The first thing I want to do is wash these miniatures off because they are pewter miniatures and they probably have a little bit of a chemical from the mold release or something on their surface that'll make painting them up not stick as well as we'd like to. I'm going to use the bags they were shipped to me in from SX Miniatures to keep them organized so that I know which guys are which as they come out of the bath, and I'm just using dish soap and a little bit of warm water. Afterwards, I lay them all out on some napkins to dry off. For the bases for these miniatures, I custom modeled them to the sizes required by the DBA rules and printed them on my home 3D printer. Of course, if you don't have one of these, it'd be very easy to cut them out of MDF or some sort of pressed wood product or even foam core, whatever you have available to get the right size of bases for your miniatures. The next bit of prep work we need to do is preparing the actual miniatures themselves. I'm going to use a pair of flush cutters here. They're flush on one side, not on the other, so that I can cut right up to a flat surface, as well as a metal file. Pewter miniatures like these often come with a bunch of offcuts, and you may want to collect them if you're interested in casting your own things with pewter or just having little bits and bobs to glue on and fill places in where you need them. A little bit of super glue and some toothpicks will help as well for later attaching things together. The last thing you're going to want to watch for is spears, javelins, that sort of thing. They've got a little bit of flash on the end of them that you can cut off, and also they're probably going to be bent out of shape slightly from shipping. So straighten them out with your fingers and snip off any flash or other sprue material that's left over from the casting process. This is a sort of time-consuming little process, but of course it's going to really make a difference in the quality of the miniatures in the end if you even put in a little bit of work here. I'm going to be the first to say I'm not as thorough as I could be. I just try to get the biggest, most egregious chunks off because I want to get the miniatures out on the table as soon as possible. File everything down as necessary. Make sure you don't damage the miniatures if you can, because pewter is a soft metal, so chipping it or banging into it may bend things out of place. The next thing I'm going to do is set up my bases. I'm going to apply super glue across the entire surface of the base, and then I'm going to press my miniatures into the base. Of course, the super glue is going to help hold them down, and we're just going to stand them up in formation. In this case, for DBA, for the type of unit that hoplites represent, it's 4 hoplites side by side, forming a little bit of a spear wall. This super glue is going to bond with baking soda and make a little bit of a sandy surface. The baking soda also acts as an activator and so holds the miniatures in place very quickly, and so you don't have to worry about knocking them over and stuff like that while they're setting up. I use baking soda instead of sand here because I want a bit of a finer texture, and baking soda is just a bit finer than a lot of the sand that I can get a hold of easily. One thing you can do is just fire a little bit of super glue into your baking soda to make little pebbles and rocks if you're going to use this for larger, like 28mm miniatures and stuff, just to mix up the surface texture. In this case, where the miniatures and the bases are so small, just sprinkling baking soda over top of the CA glue does a great job. Then just use one of your older paint brushes to sort of brush away all of the excess. An alternative, if you have an airbrush as well, would be to just blow them away with the pressurized air. That's a pretty easy way to clean off your miniatures. With what you've just brushed off, you can now sprinkle a little bit onto the miniatures' hands in preparation for attaching their spears. The hoplite spears are very small pieces and have very small contact areas for glue to attach onto. So you want a little bit of baking soda to help activate the glue and just tack them on. So you're not holding these things in place for super long while the little bit of super glue sets up. Make sure to straighten out the spears as well. They're going to have gotten bent in shipping, and they're probably going to bend while you're doing this. So just try to always pay attention to whether they're straight and whether they're correct. You can see here I'm having a little bit of trouble because there's such a small contact area, but eventually the baking soda catches it and your super glue sets up, and it's not that bad. Gonna go on now and prime the miniatures. Priming is pretty essential, especially with metal miniatures, because it's what's gonna help all of the other paint or ink or whatever you're gonna put on stick down to the miniature. I use an airbrush. I just dust them from a distance with first a blend of black and gray surface primer from Vallejo, and then after that with a little bit of gray surface primer from Vallejo over the top to give them a bit of a shade as part of the priming process. This is going to save me a little bit of work later, especially with these small miniatures, because I'm going to use ink washes to color them. It's just going to make everything look a little more shaded, which looks really good from a tabletop distance, 3 feet away on these small miniatures. Dry brushing on some white afterwards to just give even more contrast to the miniatures can help, again, accentuate this detail without you having to get down and paint in multiple shades, of the same color and do all the detail work yourself later. This is just some pre-work, some preparation that you can do to make the effect more striking later on. The better the contrast between your highest whites and your darkest blacks, the better the effect is going to be as you put your ink over top. And I would say you could go even starker a difference than I've gotten here by just skipping the gray in the middle and going black with a white dry brush or a very light dry brush to get an even more dynamic look that'll convey even better with these small miniatures. After this, I'm just going to go on and grab some India ink, in this case blue India ink, and I'm going to be applying that to all the blue areas on these miniatures. I've chosen to go with a blue and white color scheme for these guys because they're Athenian, and often in video games and that kind of stuff, they're blue, right? Their opponents for me are going to be the Spartans, because I'm setting up some Peloponnesian Wars armies for DBA, and they're going to be mainly red, so I know that may not be entirely authentic, especially for the Athenians and their citizen armies, to be uniformed, but it does, it conveys their identity much better on the tabletop, and so in this case, a little bit of gameplay and a little bit of cinematic effect is going to take priority for me. There's lots of places that you could paint blue here, including the crests, their clothing, their belts, they've got all sorts of things hanging off their shields or banners that you could be coloring in as well. Color them in as best you can. The ink is going to flow in and it's going to give texture really, really quickly and easily. Just make sure you don't overload them too much. On these small miniatures, pooling is pretty easy to get and can have a bit of a detrimental effect on the overall look. I would say easier than with bigger miniatures where there's more area to spread the ink over. Another thing you're going to want to do probably, if you're like me, is, I wanted to make some texture on these guys, so I started trying to freehand little designs and also make things stripy instead of making them just one flat color, that kind of stuff, especially with the crests and with the flags and banners and dangly bits. I'm going to be the first to admit here again, I'm not the best at freehand, but it was pretty fun and it's really good practice. This is the kind of thing that I'm probably going to want to be doing for all sorts of projects again in the future. So getting some practice in is great, and a little bit of variety, especially in the Athenian army where, like I said, the citizen soldier thing sort of implies to me that they should have had more eclectic dress than being all blue and white. A little bit of variety, at least in the designs, seems appropriate to me and does add a lot of interest to what is otherwise just a big mishmash of the same guys over and over again. SX Miniatures has several poses for their hoplites, which is great, but I will say there's only so many different ways you can pose and sculpt a guy with a spear over his head and a shield in front of him to make him look all that different in the line of battle by pose alone. So differentiating them with dresses was, in my opinion, pretty essential for this army. You can see here I'm trying freehand, pretty much my first freehand project since I started painting miniatures this year. And I'm trying to put a little owl on this banner. I'm going to do the same and put little owls on other things because, of course, the owl is the symbol of Athena, patron goddess of Athens, the city. So the little owl shapes here and there seemed appropriate to me. And it's a pretty easy shape to make with a big blobby body, and you just need to leave 2 big white areas for the eyes, and it sort of looks owly. I would say some of them sort of look like penguins or something, but close enough. I also lightened my blue in some places with a little bit of white ink, just to make different tones of blue as well. It's all still blue, but not all of the blue is the same blue, if that makes sense. As we go through and continue adding more and more designs here and there, I've got a little lambda going on this guy. I do some trim, sort of just, dots and swirls and stuff around the edges of other people's clothing and armor. Or you can go around the backs of their helmets, say they're wearing a hood or something. Lots of places you can put this on. But it's worth noting that we've actually done a lot of work for ourselves already by doing all the pre-work on making the gray areas dynamic. Since white and blue are our colors, I'm just going to be leaving a lot of areas down to the primer because that primer fills in for our white color. Here I'm just putting in a little bit of cork brown, my Vallejo cork brown. It's just one of the acrylic paints from the Medieval Color starter set, and I'm using that as the base for the sandy bases for them. I'm going to be darkening this with brown ink later on to make it look a bit more muddy, but for now, the cork brown just gives us a sandy layer to build on top of for their bases. I'm also going to be taking this brown ink now and just applying it to all of the leather areas and also the skin areas. Now I'm going to be doing a little more detail on the skin later to make it not look like leather. But brown is our base color that I'm going to be building up from on all of the skin areas. So we just want to make sure we cover everything, including the faces inside the helmets, the legs, and then, of course, the hafts of the spears. The hafts of the spears were particularly nerve-wracking because I just spent all this time making either nice blue or white crests for a lot of the helmets. So be a little careful while you do this and don't overcharge your brush because the brown flowing into places where you don't want it to could be pretty disastrous. I mean, not disastrous, of course. It's relatively easy to cover things up or correct things, especially at this scale where the details are so small. But I felt a little bit of trepidation. Now with a little bit of flow improver, the Vallejo flow improver, in some black ink, just to help improve its flow and make it flow better over the areas we're applying it to, I'm using this black ink to do stuff like black hair and also black or gray horses for the miniatures. Mixing up the colors of the horses does a lot for these cavalry units, and I tried to reserve the white horses only for when I thought, a small detail, very rare, with most of the horses being gray, black, brown, that kind of thing. In the DBA rules, it actually points out that you should leave white horses specifically for generals, but the generals are not mounted in either the Spartan or Athenian army, since they are hoplites, that noblest of profession for the citizen soldier. So if you leave some of the horses gray or white, it shouldn't be all that confusing to anyone in particular. Especially these guys, they've got the trumpeter and the flag and stuff. The general is he's a standout base, I would say. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to prepare our metal areas. This is going to use a little bit of bronze Vallejo acrylic paint mixed in with some black ink just to water it down and darken it. I'm putting this over all of the metallic areas because we're going to be applying a matte varnish later on that sort of drags down everything, gives a matte surface to the miniatures. And so if I were just to color these straight up metallic right now, they would become, well, they would be matte and not shiny, and therefore they wouldn't look all that metallic, really. So I'm just putting this dark color down now, and later on when we apply the actual metal after the varnish has been put on, we can just apply it to the raised areas and leave the dark areas either a warm, dark metallic color on the bronze areas, or on the iron areas here, sort of cooler dark metallic color that, while it doesn't have gloss, is at least sort of similar in tone to the metal because it used the same metallic paint in it. That's going to serve as the shadows on our metallic areas and mean that in the same way that sort of priming our miniatures with the dark color and the light color did some of our work ahead of time for us, this is going to do a little bit of our work ahead of time for us on the metal areas, because shading the metal areas can be kind of difficult to do. So I just get it done now. As for the choice of metals, my understanding of the period we're talking about here is that weapons were made of iron, and armor and large metallic bits that could be better cast were made of bronze, which is a metal they were more comfortable with making. So my weapon heads, such as the spear points or tips of javelins, that kind of stuff, are made of iron, and I have done the helmets, shields, armor, that sort of stuff in bronze. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to mix up a lighter tone for the skin of the miniatures using brown, yellow, magenta, and white. This is going to make a bit of a tan color that I'm going to apply over the fleshy areas of the miniatures to pick them out and make them, like I said earlier, not just look like the leather and wood areas, which I'm leaving in raw brown ink. To do this, I'm being a little selective before I apply it. just applying it to the raised areas of their skin, so areas that are catching the light best, while leaving the areas in between them shadowed. If you take a look at the legs of these skirmishers, I'm picking out, for example, the shin and the thigh, but leaving the knee shadowed. What this means is from tabletop distance, looking down at the miniatures, there's going to be this clear delineation between the upper and lower legs, and it'll make it look a little more detailed for not a lot of work. This just gives more definition to these miniatures, where a lot of detail could easily be lost on them due to their small size if you were to just leave them all one color or block paint them in flesh color instead of, leaving the dark areas, picking out the light areas. For the faces, I'm focusing on the brow, the bridge of the nose, the cheeks, and the chin to pick out only the most raised areas of the face and leave shadows where the eyes, mouth, and sort of the laugh lines or the creases of the cheeks would be. And again, hint at the shape of a face on these guys, even from a distance. Now by this point I've made a couple of mistakes where I sort of went outside of the lines, so I'm going to grab some blue ink and I am just going to touch up the colored areas here and there. Like I said, correcting can be pretty easy as long as you catch it before you're getting the matte varnish on there and it's all getting sort of different textures and stuff. These guys are really small, so on the one hand, a single mistake can cover a lot of real estate on the miniature, but on the other hand, covering it up is a very, very fine detail, and so might not be as noticeable as you might think on the end product. Grabbing some brown ink now to cover up my cork brown on the bases. Now the cork brown gave a sort of sandy texture, but I want to drag that down, make it a deeper, darker, more fertile earth-looking thing. Again, historical context in my mind here, the Greeks are fighting over fertile farmland, the pasture lands of Greece. Their biannual wars were largely for control of these or over an insult or slight or something or other. So making it all look, dicey, dark, and muddy is sort of my default, not just in this case, but in the cases of pretty much any medieval miniatures I make. And I'm sure when I make miniatures of other time periods in the future, I'm going to be doing a very similar thing, because dark brown mud is just kind of a common thing to fight over. I'm now going to use some Woodland Scenics flock and Mod Podge glue, and I'm going to flock the bases, give them a little bit of a grass covering here. My flock here is a bit of a dryish, lightish gray. In my opinion, appropriate for sort of sun-scorched Greece. You could also get fancier and apply multiple different layers of different colors of flock, or mix different colors of flock in a single bottle. I'm just using the one bottle as what I have. So I put the glue on in a sort of patchy fashion around the edges of the base, and then just tap the grass on, trying to make sure that as much as the grass as possible is held pinched between my fingers and is touching down with its tips so it stands up straight. Now I'm going to varnish my miniatures. Now I don't have any footage of that because I didn't have my camera out at the time, but I'm just applying it with an airbrush in the same way that I applied my primer at the very start of this whole process, dusting it on from a distance, and making sure, in this case with the varnish in particular, that it doesn't get like shiny. I haven't applied too much because it's a matte varnish. It shouldn't really be a very thick layer, it should just make it matte, and if you apply too much it gets cloudy and thick on the miniature, so you don't want that. Now that I'm finished up, I'm going to be finishing the edges of the bases. I'm going to use black flow acrylic, and I'm going to be painting over the edges here on the trim. But first, I'm just going to make sure that all of this extra flock that sort of flaked over the edges is out of the way, so the edges of my bases are nice, crisp, and square, or as square as I can get them. In this case, I'm just scraping with an X-Acto knife to get as much of the flock off as possible, and I'm going to paint over whatever's still stuck there because, if there's a little bit there, it's not that big a deal. These bases do need to be able to slot together edge to edge, though, for the game of DBA, because things lining up with each other, everything's measured in base widths, and it's all very precise. So I want these things to slot together satisfyingly and just butt up against each other, edge to edge. Having done the edges of the bases with black paint, I'm now finally going to apply my metallic colors to the miniatures. Those areas that we prepared earlier with our sort of shadowed, darkened metal colors, I'm now going to touch with the actual metal color. I'm going to use the bronze paint from Vallejo for the bronze areas, and the silver paint from Vallejo for the iron areas. As I mentioned before, bronze for me is most of the shields, armor, helmets, that kind of stuff, whereas the iron is the spear tips and the weapon heads. The one thing that you should do for a really authentic and proper ancient Greek army that I didn't do is put designs on the shields. I was going to and I wanted to, but I don't have any decals, and freehanding them seemed like just a lot of work at this point because there were a lot of miniatures. I would recommend me doing them in smaller batches than me if you're going to do a 15mm armor like this, army like this, or having decals to do the shields instead of thinking you were going to freehand them, because that was pretty exhausting. And right now I'm about to go on a long trip for work, and I don't really have time for that kind of detail. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed following along with me as I painted up this big army of Athenians for Bellis Antiquitatis or any other 15mm war game. If you got any questions, suggestions, comments, please leave them down in the comments. I love to see that. And as always, go play some games.